One night, Jane participated in the most shocking murder committed in Richmond that I have ever heard of in this place. The crime was so gruesome that there never was such an excitement created in this place before as there was yesterday. It is thought that at least 4,000 persons went to see the horrifying spectacle on yesterday. As the records have it, on July 19, 1852, Jane entered her master's chambers, and a more awful scene of butchery and bloodshed was never perhaps presented in one family. I'll be back. Hello, welcome back. Those who have seen part 1, thank you so much. And those who have not seen part 1, I implore you to go check out part 1 before checking this out. Those who are returning, thanks again. And let's get on. But I would like to say this. I always was interested in knowing the truth about how slaves, felt being in bondage, other than what I imagined and other people conveyed. But some of the things that people said about slaves and slavery is not quite the truth and is very, very much diluted. And I've been stumbling across the material that confirmed that is very much diluted. And I was told years ago that Abraham Lincoln didn't free the slaves. Who freed the slaves were slaves. There were so many revolts happening, so many instances of resistance that they couldn't control them. There are so many examples of how slaves demonstrated how much they could not stand slavery. They hated being treated that way. And they hated their families being wrecked and children being taken from them and husbands being killed and wives being killed and people being violently assaulted in every way you can imagine. They hated it. Anyone who wants to sit there and make slavery seem like it's just a hiccup in history, you need to experience slavery. Okay, let's get on with it. In February 1861, the Alexandria Gazette ran a piece that captured the sentiments of many Upper South slave owners as the country was right on the edge of civil war. An anxious reader sent a letter which forcefully asks, "Are not the abolitionists bent on our ruin? Are not there missionaries even now all through the South inciting our quiet slaves to poison and kill, to introduce anarchy and horrors?" This quotation is taken from a letter by a man named Clifton, said to be living in Charleston, South Carolina, with the letter having been allegedly submitted by his friend in Virginia. What is most striking about this quotation is that it allows a view into the thoughts of slaveholders. Significantly, according to the author, slaves were quiet, and it was at the instigation of outsiders that they were led to poison. This indicates that the author believed that slaves were somewhat content with their lives and could have no possible reason for their own to want to poison their masters. 1857 issues of the Richmond Inquirer echoed the sentiments of Clifton's letter. According to the paper, abolitionists posing as traveling salesmen were laboring to incite discontent among slaves, hoping that slaves would in turn revolt and murder their owners. These abolitionists were disrupting the quiet and good order of Southern society by tampering with our slaves. And while there was notable agitation in slaves in some locations, the paper tried to assure masters that they need not worry. or they need not fear. The slaves in most places, being well content with their condition and devotedly attached to their owners, surely had no such malicious designs. And even in the places where slaves were stirring, this was not of their own volition, but was attributable in every instance to machinations of white men. I guess they had to say whatever they needed to say to sleep good at night, right? Let's go on. Here we once again see and express disbelief in any animosity originating from slaves themselves. The later issue of the Richmond Inquirer reveals what is possibly at the heart of this belief. Paternalism in the 19th century. Genovese argues that slaveholders saw themselves as the best, the sincerest, indeed the only friends that American blacks had. And I say to that, if you were friends, I would hate to see if you were the enemy. Let's continue. For these masters, slavery was not an institution of exploitation and degradation. It was a practice of protection and beneficence. According to a piece reproduced in the Richmond Inquirer, the abolitionists were trying to break asunder the parental bonds of mutual love and attachment that bind masters and slave into one harmonious and endearing union. It is exactly this mentality that potentially would have allowed slaves to get away with poisoning their masters, as paternalists were too blind to slaves' discontent to suspect that they might try to kill them. In a sense, slaves could literally get away with murder. To hear the residents of the Upper South tell it, slavery was a great time for all, and all would be well if Northerners minded their own business. But this is actually a fairly distinct ideology. Their 18th century counterparts saw slavery for what it was, and so did their Deep South 19th century equivalents. The only reason Virginia slave owners stayed in the dark is because that is exactly where they wanted to be. To understand poison prosecution in 19th century Virginia, it is truly essential to explore the ideology around slavery. In contrast to the sunnier views mentioned above, stands the views of 18th century Virginia slave owners and 19th century Deep South slave owners. In A Fearsome and Beautiful Place, Thomas Jefferson, the celebrated founding father and infamous Virginia slave owner, captures the sentiment of his generation towards slavery as well. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means, only a revolution of the wheel of fortune and exchange of situation is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. Here, not only is slavery seen as evil and degrading, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, it is so bad that God might even have to intervene. This viewpoint was not unique to Jefferson, though. In his study, Jeffersonian Views of Slavery, Robert Macaulay asserts that during the 18th century, leading Virginians denounced slavery as a curse upon their land. And you guys today seem to forget that. Like, how many really believe that a price is not going to be paid for the evils that was done to people who were enslaved? Let's continue. The dominant social ideology in the 17th and 18th centuries where masters offered protection their slaves with the expectation of receiving obedience in return. If any slave dared to be disobedient, they could expect the swift retribution of a wrathful and unforgiving father figure. And they could expect being molested and sexually violated as well, men included, and children. You were trying to act like a father figure, but then at the same time you were violating these men, women, and children in every way known under the sun. So don't you see the perversion and warped mind these enslavers had? Let's continue. It took until 1769 for Virginia lawmakers to realize that casually castrating slaves for running away was often disproportionate to the offense and contrary to the principles of humanity. In general, slave owners in the 18th century saw slavery as a necessary evil and were far more concerned with expanding their wealth and status than with convincing anyone the morality of their actions. Patriarchs did not expect their slaves to be content or submissive. The myth of the happy and docile slave was not an 18th century invention. The ideology of paternalism, a seemingly more loving and benevolent system than patriarchalism, grew out of the necessity to discipline and morally justify a system of exploitation. In other words, it was a system that attempted to justify the unjustifiable, and they're still trying to justify it today. Let's continue. Paternalistic slave owners of the 19th century provided well for their slaves and expected loyalty in return, even taking seemingly benevolent and unnecessary actions such as throwing parties for their slaves and hosting Easter egg hunts. All of these actions were taken with the hope to render slaves content and loyal, and slave owners being fully invested in believing their own rationalizations seemed sincerely shocked when slaves revolted. Opposing this view due to their awareness of slave discontent, 18th century masters rarely underestimated their slaves' capacity to rebel. While the residents of the Upper South tried to maintain the fantasy of mutual benefit, residents in Deep South were far more honest about the realities of slavery. Residents of the Deep South were more forthright in assuming that slavery was an exploitative relationship and were unconcerned with providing excuses or rationales for it. For them, it was a grim and difficult institution. 19th century Virginia planters viewed the institution as a fair exchange, leading them to believe more erroneously that their slaves were happy. 18th century masters knew and acknowledged that slavery was exploitative and that all men naturally sought liberty. With 18th century and lower South slave owners aware of the evils of slavery and by extension their slaves' willingness to do what it took to be free, they were likely more suspicious and were therefore abler to protect themselves from attacks by poison. As such, the opposite is likely true for slave-owning residents in antebellum Virginia. Jane Williams was a slave to a young and popular wholesale Richmond grocer named Joseph Pendleton Winston. Mr. Winston lived in Richmond with his wife, Virginia, their infant daughter, Virginia Bell, and their house slaves, Jane, John, Nellie, and Anna. Jane Williams was in a trusted position in the house. She acted as a caretaker for the home, a nurse, and was allowed to sleep in the kitchen. They were young, popular, and financially secure. The Winstons seemed to have it all. But this would come to a horrific end that no one in their community could comprehend. One night, Jane participated in the most shocking act of unaliving someone in Richmond that I have ever heard of in this place. The crime was so gruesome that there never was such an excitement created in this place before as there was yesterday. It is thought that at least 4,000 persons went to see the horrifying spectacle on yesterday. As the records have it, on July 19, 1852, Jane entered her master's chambers, and a more awful scene of butchery and bloodshed was never perhaps presented in one family. Their faces and heads were, I'm not even going to describe what she did, but she did a job on them. She did a number on them. And Jane attempted to terminate the entire family. Mr. Winston, by some miracle, managed to survive the attack. His family was not so lucky. John, Jane's husband, was also implicated in the crime. John had been hired out to T.J. Glenn and Company the prior year, experiencing many of the freedoms other hired slaves enjoy, including having time away from his owner. Revealing how city slavery changed expectations, John complained of too much work, threatened his overseer, and made veiled threats towards Mr. Winston. John was said to be so belligerent that his employer did not discipline him for fear of having his house burned down in retaliation. Although slavery was still slavery, the power dynamic had changed to the point where masters clearly feared the slaves, which shows just how odd relations could become under relaxed ownership. Jane was also known to be very stubborn and insolent towards her position in life. The animosity between the Williams and Winstons was an ongoing occurrence. Despite having good reason to fear their slaves, the Winstons allowed their slaves some indulgences, including allowing them to read and write. After Nat Turner's rebellion, slaves were by law supposed to have their literacy curtailed, but these laws were clearly not as enforced as authorities could have hoped. As many slave owners saw government order as meddling in their affairs, John was actually writing letters back and forth to friends in Liberia, stating that he shall use every prudent exertion to see you all again. Although Jane confessed to the crime and insisted John had nothing to do with it, he was convicted all the same. This created doubt in many as to his guilt and the legitimacy of his conviction. In her confession, Jane admitted she had been brooding over her bloody revenge for some time. And unsurprisingly, the hatred Jane felt for her owners was beyond comprehension to paternalistic slave owners. But for all of the media attention, the public outrage, and the thousands of spectators who come to witness her awful end, Jane held onto a secret into her grave. Back in 1850, Joseph and Virginia lost another infant daughter named Lavinia Carey. Her death was little noted as infant mortality was a sadly familiar occurrence for the age. After her hanging, Jane's white pastor, Reverend Robert Ryland, revealed that Jane had poisoned the child by administering just a teaspoon of bedbug poison, but she wanted this kept silent until after she was dead so as to be hanged officially and not by a lynch mob. This one case encapsulates many aspects of slavery in antebellum Virginia. Paternalistic slave owners tried to treat their slaves with what they thought was kindness and hoped that in exchange for relaxed treatment, slaves would grant them loyalty. This sunny view of slavery kept the Winstons and others like them from seeing the extent of the disdain their slaves held for them. The fact that Jane was openly antagonistic towards her owners, yet was still able to poison their baby, live with them for almost 2 more years while still being antagonistic, and ultimately axe murder the family, shows that appropriate levels of fear and distrust did not exist within the Winstons. Their illusions about the institution of slavery kept them blind to the danger lurking within their own household and holds the implication that other unnoticed poisonings could have killed other oblivious owners. And I would say that they lived in they did. They live in an unrealistic world thinking that they can put somebody in bondage. And just because they're kind to them, that they're going to get it back. You have someone against their will. You're holding someone against their will, and no matter how kind you are to them, they still have disdain in their hearts towards you because they're not there on their own free will. It's like, what kind of mentality is that? Oh, I'm going to have you in bondage, and I'm going to be kind to you. So you should be kind to me. Let's go on. The Winstons were not the only family to be blissfully unaware that their baby's poisoner was living amongst them. The dangers of slow poisoning and oblivious owners once again showed itself in Chesterfield County in 1857. A man named Edward Gill had, along with his family, been very sick for a month. Within short proximity, 2 of his children died and the rest of the family remained ill. Trying to get to the bottom of this mysterious illness, physicians searched the house and discovered that their cook was in possession of carbonate of lead and sugar of lead and had been mixing it into their food for an extended period of time. The family had suspected nothing. One can only imagine how many cases of drawn-out illnesses or sudden deaths was incorrectly attributed to nature and not vengeful slaves. In July of 1862, Thomas J. and Mary Frances Winston lost 2 daughters in under a week. One died of a lingering illness, the other of a brief illness of 48 hours. Losing 2 people in the same household in anything other than an epidemic is highly suspicious. Was this just coincidental family tragedy or something of more malevolent design? In a similar vein, John H. Miller, a second lieutenant in the National Guard as well as a fireman, met an untimely end. After a brief but painful illness, there are red flags all over that obituary. Perfectly healthy, active men do not typically die sudden, painful, mysterious deaths. Although there's no way to know what they died of, this language is illustrative of obituaries that should be looked at with more scrutiny. In Carolina County in 1854, a slave named Sally stood accused of poisoning the baby of Mr. and Miss Jennings, the family she had been hired out to. Miss Jennings left Sally alone with her 7th-month-old so that she could go do laundry. When she returned, the baby appeared to be strangled and had lanidon on its clothing. Sally denied giving the infant anything. The baby did not survive. This case illustrates how slaves could use readily available household poisons against their owners, and that even quick discovery of the poisoning was no guarantee for survival. Likewise, in 1865, a hired-out slave in the role of a nurse named Eliza stood accused of poisoning her employer's infant. She had been living with them for 2 years at the time. However, as there was no clear evidence of any wrongdoing, Eliza was discharged. Was Eliza's case one where justice prevailed, protecting the slave from paranoid accusations, or was there really something more sinister to it? It is hard to say, but there are many more nannies who stood accused of poisoning children. Perhaps an equally, if not more dangerous role for slaves to take on was that of cook. In 1854 in Hanover County, Mr. Yarborough and his entire family was almost snuffed out by a single dinner. The family was overtaken by a violent sickness and their health in a most precarious situation. All the while, their slave cook pretended to be sick in bed. with the examining doctor aware of her deception. Could the family have ever suspected that they shared their dwellings with their attempted murderer? Most likely not, as many people just like them made this potentially fatal mistake. In another 1854 case, this time in Richmond, a slave named Grace, belonging to Miss Elizabeth King and hired to Miss Eliza Ann Wingfield, attempted to kill the entire family of her employer of 2 months by putting poison into their morning coffee. Nobody noticed anything amiss until everyone started becoming violently ill. In horror, Miss Wingfield called for Dr. Lewis and Power and demanded that Grace drink the coffee, which she obliged to. Upping the ante, not only did Grace drink the poisoned coffee herself, she also gave some to her 2 children. Grace ended up suffering the most, as she barely drank any coffee, whereas the others had drunk enough to vomit, purging most of the poison from their systems. Grace never recovered and died from her own poison attempt. It is speculated that in a final show of agency to avoid trial, Grace gave herself another dose of arsenic as she died after having been well on the mend. Upon examining her items, 2 large papers of arsenic were found in her clothing. This led to the vexatious question, how did she acquire them? The newspaper ruled out her ability to buy it or to steal it, and implies there were perhaps shadowy figure at work. While dying, Grace claimed a brickyard boy gave her a white powder, which he said was good to clear coffee. Seeing as she claimed this interaction was only in passing and he gave her but a handful of the substance, this story is almost certainly a fabrication, leaving the terrifying question of how she acquired such a large amount of poison. But these cases are not unique. There seems to have been a constant flow of slaves poisoning their owners' food. In Whiteville in 1855, 4 slaves were arrested for putting arsenic in the bread and coffee of Miss John B. George. Near Halifax Courthouse in 1855, a slave employed by Reverend John A. Scott attempted to poison the minister and his family. The slave put strychnine in the beans he served the family for dinner. The bitter taste prevented the family from eating the beans. While rational thought would dictate calling the authorities to investigate, they instead served the beans to a cat who died within an hour. They also served the poisoned beans to their dog. The results were not pretty. In 1856, in King William County, a slave cook named Martha tried to poison the entirety of her master Samuel F. Norman's family. Unlike other slaves mentioned in this paper, Martha was known for being a valuable and trusty servant. On one occasion, Mr. Norman's 5-year-old daughter took deathly ill, with the doctor insisting it was poison, but Mr. Norman refusing to accept such charges. So here we see a medical expert ignored, and the appropriate levels of fear and mistrust not adopted. A few days later, the family was served a strange tasting breakfast. Mr. Norman took ill but was saved by the doctor. Martha admitted to putting glass and Jameson weed seed into their food with every intention of killing them. The most shocking bit is they trusted her so much despite her only being with them for 2 months. But it is not only women or domestics who try their hands at poisoning their masters. Women were often accused of poisoning within households. Men, however, hold on almost exclusive right to poisoning activities beyond home boundaries. In 1856, in Richmond, a bold plot unraveled. 2 slaves hired to do factory work. Sam, described as a small boy And William Jackson attempted to poison their overseer, William B. Mann. Sam was sent to fetch his overseer's breakfast and had apparently slipped poison into his coffee. Despite vomiting after drinking it and his wife pointing out an unusual white substance in the coffee pot, Mann suspected nothing. A little over a week later, Mann sent Sam to fetch his breakfast again, drank the foul coffee, and then discovered a white substance at the bottom that a doctor confirmed to be arsenic. Sam then admitted to putting the substance in the coffee, but said that Jackson had paid him 4 pence and then threatened his life. Jackson's motive seems to have been revenge for the mere threat of being disciplined for some earlier offense. Here the poisoned white once again showed an eerie display of ignorance. Despite having every logical reason to suspect he had been poisoned, it took 2 attempts before he took it seriously. Yep, they still don't take black folks seriously. Let's continue. In 1856, after repeatedly being caught and punished by the slave patrol in New Kent, a slave named Pleasant decided to have some revenge. Contrary to his name, Pleasant was described as being of a surly disposition and not feeling disposed to submit to any restraints from his superiors. The patrol had a habit of resting at the home of Justice Captain Thomas Morris, where conveniently Pleasant's daughter Helen was employed. He gave her muriatic acid to put in a decanter the patrol usually drank from, but then the plan failed. The patrol did not visit, but Justice Morris drank the concoction. Here it was a non-domestic slave working with a female slave in a household to achieve his goals. Miraculously, Pleasant was acquitted. But men could also poison masters in the domestic sphere. In 1858, just outside of Harrisonburg, a 13-year-old slave boy tried to murder the family he was living with. Showing how easily poison could be obtained, he simply took poison that had been placed in the kitchen to kill rats in the coffee pot. Poisoning could sometimes be a group activity as well. In 1860, in Lunenburg, 3 slaves, John, Dick, and Oline, tried to kill a white family by placing a strong mixture of poisonous herb or plant into a milk basin. This made the milk smell strange, so no one drank it. The 3 slaves involved actually managed to escape before being hunted down. They were executed together with a pastor warning the slaves present of the necessity of obedience to their masters. This was simply wishful thinking of the pastors. See, that was the problem. They used the Bible against slaves and thought it was going to make them be obedient. No. And the way slaves were treated in the Bible was completely opposite of how North American treated slaves. Completely opposite. In Northumberland County in 1861, 2 mysterious poisonings occurred. In a report on March the 5th, Mr. Charles W. Follen and a friend were poisoned. Although they survived, the culprits, believed to be slaves, succeeded in killing 4 horses, 2 mules, 20 head of hogs, and a number of sheep. Mere days later, in the same county, a Mr. Ormsby faced a similar attack and lost several heads of cattle. The community was understandably outraged. Almost 40 slaves were arrested, their motives being freedom through murder first. This once again shows the non-gendered and collaborative efforts poisoning could take on. But perhaps the case that takes the cake is a slave boy named Anderson who allegedly poisoned a wedding custard in South County in 1855. A wealthy lawyer was marrying into a likewise wealthy family, and they were throwing a lavish reception for around 100 guests. Everyone was having a great time until people started to feel sick. all of whom were suffering severely from nausea, burning in the stomach, and all other horrible symptoms which manifest themselves when arsenic is swallowed. Doctors were called to the scene and discovered the custard was in fact strongly impregnated with arsenic. At least 25 people were expected to die. Mysteriously, most of the slaves were also sick as they had eaten the custard too. But the slave boy Anderson was the one in charge of the custard that day. He was ordered to put the custard in the spring house to keep it cool. He was gone for 2 hours doing this task, despite the spring house only being 100 yards away. When Anderson was sent to fetch it, half the custard was missing. And although Anderson was at the party, he and 2 other slaves ate food other than the custard. Anderson had apparently been very pushy, insisting that people eat the custard. They suspect that someone had furnished Anderson with the arsenic. There were also theories that arsenic had not been used at all and that the poisoning was accidental. Regardless, it was never proven conclusively what happened that night and who, if anyone, was involved. All of these cases highlight the vulnerability of a slave-owning society, especially one that is in denial of its brutality. Slave owners in the 19th century Virginia tried to convince themselves that slavery was a beneficial institution of the enslaved by believing their own lies. They reasoned that slaves were happy with their condition. This led them to keep slaves in their homes in trusted positions and to relax the harshness of their punishments. By allowing slaves to be and believe themselves to be independent and ignoring signs of hostility, slave owners opened themselves up to being poisoned, with themselves being none the wiser. On many actions whites took to try to protect themselves, changing laws was probably their least effective. Despite the laws aiming to stop blacks from poisoning, slaves were still able to acquire poison readily. In Norfolk in 1832, a slave named Elizabeth was looking to acquire rat poison to kill 2 other women in her household. She went to one shop and was refused. She went to a second shop and lied, saying that she was getting an order for a slave known for being trusty, and was able to acquire the poison, which she used to deadly effect. Further weakness of the legislation was revealed in a proposed amendment in 1842 that wanted corporal punishment for any black or mulatto, free or enslaved, who was caught selling medicine. The case that inspired this law involved a black man who got a hold of arsenic and started selling it as a beneficial medicine. This amendment failed as other legislators felt current laws already covered the issue. This is very revealing in that despite laws being on the books, they clearly were not acting as the deterrent whites had hoped for. The amendment was useless as they could not even enforce the laws they already had. But 19th century lawmakers did still attempt to stop poisonings by slaves, even if they did not go to the extremes of their ancestors. In 1856, Virginia's Senate passed an act to prevent the sale of poisonous drugs to free Negroes and slaves. Under this law, slaves could still buy poison as long as they had proof that they were sent on behalf of their owner. This law was also one of many to come that made free blacks less free than their white counterparts. The punishment for whites violating this law was not insubstantial, with a fine of $500 and no less than 1 year and no more than 2 in jail. Perhaps this point to a growing sense of distrust not only towards slaves but also white merchants. A newspaper piece later that year called for a similar punishment for whites selling slaves more conventional weapons, such as such weapons are no doubt sold to them by white persons, or they could not get them. This commentator goes on to show just how little agency whites believed slaves had, though, as they state that Negroes have no more business with deadly weapons than children. and know as little how to use them. Here, once again, the ignorance of the slave owning class is displayed. And they still have that mentality. It's arrogant and it's foolish. Let's continue. Much like earlier reports condemning abolitionists as rabble rousers, upsetting and otherwise benign slave population, this writer underestimates blacks in their ability to mobilize their vengeance. Slaves knew how to use weapons, and use them they did. Despite their harsh language and angry gesturing, the laws whites passed seemed to be completely in vain, as slaves were still able to somehow acquire poison. In Jericho County in 1859, a slave named Peter gave a free black woman named Nancy Harris arsenic, claiming that it was a medicine that would help cure her alcoholism. When they arrested Peter, they found arsenic on his person. Although Peter did not poison a white person in this incident, it still points out some disturbing truth. Despite being a slave, Peter was able to acquire poison, and a lot of it at that. In the case of William Jackson, the slave who tried to poison his overseer mentioned earlier, the mystery remained as to how he got his hands on arsenic in the first place, as he could not have purchased it. While this accusation seems conspiratorial on the surface, there could be some truth to it. While legislation aimed to stop the sale of poisons to slaves, this was only addressing one part of the problem. Slaves poisoning their masters was not just a product of neglectful white merchants not taking necessary precautions, but also the result of whites actively providing slaves with poison in conspiracies. In Dinwiddie County in 1859, the entire family of Thomas G. Chapel was poisoned. After examination, it was discovered that arsenic had been placed in their coffee. Suspicion rested upon a certain white party having instigated a Negro to the commission of the murderous deed. The following year in Caroline County, yet another white man was accused of inducing a Negro to administer poison to his master. The white conspirator was the brother-in-law of the victim. He furnished Nelson, the slave, with money and strychnine, with the strychnine being discovered upon an autopsy of the murdered master's stomach. This adds a new facet to slave resistance. When they were prevented from acting on their own, they could use and be used by their master's enemies to meet a common goal. So with murderous slaves and murderous whites helping said murderous slaves, what was a community to do? If you don't know the answer, I don't. Let's go on. A piece from 1859 shows that authorities still had no luck in tracking down the sellers of illicit poisons and were frustrated by their ability to stop the frightful practice. The difficulty of ascertaining from whom and by what means it is obtained, it is becoming a matter of serious consideration in our community. Although blanket legislation was passed against blacks regarding poison, as mentioned earlier, poison was not the exclusive territory of blacks. In 1856, in Pendleton County, a respectable citizen named Elijah Stonestreet suddenly dropped dead under suspicious circumstances. An investigation discovered that someone poisoned his butter with strychnine. His wife was having an affair, and she and her lover were the most likely culprits. In 1858, in Rappahannock County, the wife of Jason H. Johnson was poisoned by her husband when he gave her a glass of poisoned lemonade. When she complained of the taste, he lied and said it was a health drink with aloe in it. He had gone shopping for coffins just days before and was discovered to be having an inappropriate relationship with his wife's niece. In another 1859 case, this time in Stafford County, a slave was once again able to acquire poison. One day, Mr. James M. Scott noticed that the water in his glass tasted like acid. He was immediately suspicious and was going to take the water to be analyzed, but somehow forgot to follow up. About a week later, the same happened with his coffee. A slave girl in his household admitted to putting oxalic acid in his drinks, which she had obtained from her mother, who lived in Fredericksburg, who had intended for her to use it as a stain remover. After 1801, Virginia law allowed slaves convicted of capital offense to be sold outside of the state instead of being killed. By allowing slaves to be transported for capital crimes, Virginia noticeably reduced its rate of executions. Between 1785 and 1865, 986 hanged after receiving capital convictions. In the case of poisonings, granted the victims did not die, slaves convicted of the offense could have their convictions commuted to transportation. Part of the reasoning behind transportation was to stop the spectacle of public hangings. Whereas in the past, slave owners used public hangings as a way to deter slaves from undesired behavior. Slavers of the 19th century started to view this as an absolutely ghastly behavior, once again showing an important difference in mentalities. After perhaps more compelling reason was that hanging slaves cost the state money. Some view hanging slaves as rather a costly luxury to the people of Virginia. The opposition, many authorities felt that transportation was no punishment at all. Some feared that it was perhaps even a welcome punishment and could encourage slaves to act out, as they would only face the punishment of being sold. This disagreement about slave punishment was largely along economic lines. There was a great divide in how wealthy slave owners and the general public reacted to slave poisonings. More often than not, slaves convicted of poisoning had their sentence reduced to transportation, much to the horror of non-elites. Slave owners and the government benefited from selling slaves as opposed to killing them, as they considered hanging slaves by law to be a costly luxury, because the state was required to compensate the owner. Their less wealthy neighbors were enraged, as the crime of poisoning is too fearful, too dangerous to the peace of society to admit of an appeal to mercy in any shape. Ultimately, the elites prevailed, and slaves convicted of poisoning continued to be sold. All of this begs the question, though: who in their right mind would knowingly purchase a homicidal slave with a penchant for poison? And where exactly were these slaves going? With so many transportations, the public was understandably left wondering to what part of the world the laws of Virginia authorities the transportation of her criminals. With hundreds of slaves, including prisoners, being regularly sold, where could they possibly go? The disturbing answer is no one was really sure. Swartz supposes that destinations for transportation included Cuba, Spanish Florida, dry Tortugas. But by 1857, European colonies were less willing to buy slaves with violent backgrounds. To further murder the certainty of convicted slaves being sold beyond the limits of the United States, there were also fewer places abroad to sell convicted slaves to, as slavery in British and French West Indies was legally over. This leaves the most likely destination for these slaves, with a proven record for destruction, being Virginia's sister state in the deep South. This was a less than thrilling fact for the residents of those states. Virginia was a slave breeding state and had been providing slaves to the lower South at great profit and great numbers for some time. The southern states had a problem with Virginia selling and sending slaves who attempted to murder their masters or who were acquitted in some kind of way. They didn't want those slaves sold to the South, and but they continued to do it, and people were pissed off. Where they were more so scared than pissed off, because they're like, wait a minute, these slaves tried to kill somebody, and you bringing them over here? What? In 1840, a Virginia slave trader named William H. Williams attempted to smuggle convict slaves into New Orleans, but the mayor had been warned in advance, so was able to detain Williams upon arrival. Ironically, the contraband slaves were auctioned off anyways. Strangely, although many people were understandably upset by the thought of convict slaves being sold from Virginia further south, others were so desperate for labor that they pushed successfully to have many of the restrictive trade laws removed. What I find mind-boggling is that you have criminals calling other people criminals. The whole institution of slavery was a big, huge crime that the world participated in. And so when slaves said, you know what, we ain't feeling what y'all did to me, I ain't feeling what y'all did to my kids and my husband or my wife, and I'm gonna fight back, then they were criminals. Criminals calling somebody a criminal, right? In 1858, slaves who were convicted of a felony could be used by the state for public works instead of being transported elsewhere. While this was a somewhat satisfactory solution, how much damage had already been done? Alabama's governor and many others feared that Virginia's transported slaves could continue their crime streaks when sold. But how real was the threat of repeat poison offenders? Although research has yet to reveal any specific cases, the possibility is not far-fetched. In a similar vein, an 1843 issue of the Vermont Telegraph recounts a story that, if true, affirms the fear shown by the governor. A Miss Chapman living near Athens, Alabama, was murdered by 3 of her slaves while her husband was away. The slaves attempted to kill Mr. Chapman upon his return, with 2 being captured and 1 escaping. The man who escaped was reported to be a 45-year-old slave from Virginia who maintained he had killed his previous owners back in Virginia. A poison case from Richmond in 1852 threatened to tear Richmond's community apart and showed how even one-ton killers could be sent on to other states. Phyllis was a slave belonging to the estate of Mr. Philip T. White and working for Mr. Patrick H. Butler when she attempted to poison Mr. Butler's 5-year-old son. Just prior to attempted murder, the Butlers were having great difficulty in controlling Phyllis, who was being insolent and abusive towards Mr. Butler. Apparently, Phyllis became so uncontrollable that Mr. Butler whipped her several times and then sent her to jail as a punishment. And then, contrary to nature, common sense, and all that is sane, they brought her back home. Since her return home, she had been unusually sullen, treating the little boy in particular, whom she had always appeared to dislike, in a harsh manner. This once again shows just how oblivious paternal slave owners were. Phyllis openly showed her disdain for Miss Butler. It was known that she never liked her master's son. She went to jail and came back with a worse attitude than before, yet they somehow saw no problem with trusting the care of their child with her. Makes you wonder if they even cared about the child. Let's continue. If that level of open animosity could occur, yet they were still blindsided by her attempting to kill their son, it's a wonder any masters of similar ideology made it out alive. Miss Butler had been given a morphine solution by her doctor. She took a bit of it and left the rest of it on the masterpiece in her son's room. The next morning, she entered the room only to discover an empty vial and a sick child. The doctor was immediately called for and was able to save the child, showing how impartial forensics were. When they sent the child's vomit to be tested to try to prove that he had been poisoned, the examiner admitted that it was impossible to tell what, if anything, had been given maliciously and what had been given by the doctor to save the child. They had to rely on circumstantial evidence, the empty vial, and the child saying Phyllis gave him water that tasted sour. Phyllis washing the tumbler she used that morning, and the boy's physical symptoms matching those of someone overdosing on morphine or another powerful narcotic. Phyllis, due to her young but unstated age, had her sentence commuted to transportation with her value appraised at $600. This sentence sparked outrage, as poisoning has always been regarded as a crime of singularly enormity, for it is a deliberate act necessarily implying malice. People feared that if nurses for poisoning children are only to undergo the punishment of transportation, which is in most instances a pleasure rather than a punishment, whose child is not in danger? Of course, they didn't feel that way about slaves' children, because in their minds, slaves and their children and spouses weren't people. Let's continue. In a similar tale, an 1859 issue of the Alexandria Gazette reported that a slave girl belonging to a Mr. George Crosdale poisoned her master's baby with linodum. What is more shocking is that this behavior seemed to have run in her family. Other family members of the girl poisoned Mr. Crosdale's brother, sister-in-law, and 2 children. Despite this, the slave girl was admittedly sold south. This is a very interesting case, as it does not appear that the slave girl went to trial, which should suggest she was very young, perhaps 7 or younger. Despite being demonstrably dangerous with a pedigree to poison, Virginians sold her to people less aware of her history and the danger she posed. Cases involving young poisonous nannies appeared to be shockingly common. In yet another instance, a case from 1860, Fanny, an ill-mannered, gruff-looking slave girl belonging to Miss Elizabeth Meredith, was hired by Mr. R.F. Luck. Miss Luck had reprimanded Fanny in a mild manner for behaving badly. This made Fanny incredibly angry, and she acted out by refusing to eat supper. For reasons beyond rational thinking, the next morning the Lucks left Fanny alone with their 7-month-old baby. When Miss Luck returned to check on the baby, she found a pill in its bed. Asked Fanny if she knew what it was. Fanny answered no, so Miss Luck just threw it into the fire. It was only after Miss Luck went to feed the child that she noticed that it was sick and had a dark substance in its mouth. Finally, Miss Luck decided to call authorities. The poison was actually blistered salve that had been kept around the house. Doctors were called in and they were able to save the baby. Fanny was taken to jail, and her actions there speak loudly for her feelings towards her action. After the arrest of the prisoner, a gentleman who saw her told her that he had been sent down to hang her. With as much indifference as a dog could exhibit, she bared her neck for the halter, and remarking that she had done nothing, told him to hang her as soon as he pleased. The writer for the paper, disgusted by Fanny's actions, and declared that she would no doubt be punished, as she should be, by hanging. Once again, how very wrong was he. Upon trial, despite Fanny's attorney, Mr. James R. Crenshaw, making an able argument in her behalf, Fanny was found guilty of attempting to kill her employer's baby. But once again, a dangerous nanny would not be hung for her crime. Fanny was valued at the hefty sum of $1,000 and sentenced to transportation beyond the limits of the United States. As noted earlier, it is highly doubtful that Fanny was actually sold outside the United States. So the Deep South most likely once again had a murderous, poisonous, and different young woman sold into their midst. For slaves to resort to such drastic measures demonstrated how vile the wicked slavery was, or the wicked institution of slavery was. You think that if slaves were treated kindly and like family, as some delusional people would like us to believe, they would not have unalived whole families. If people had a choice and weren't put in bondage and weren't oppressed, and families separated forever, and husbands unalived and wives unalived, and husbands violated and wives violated and children violated, they would have had a better attitude. But you took me away from my family. You separated me from everyone I knew and loved. You brought me into your ridiculous culture that I never really quite learned. Then you called me every name but a child of God, and then forced me to take care of you and your family. And I didn't know how to let go of that pain and anger that was caused by what you did to me. Yeah, it's a possibility you would have ate some food or drunk some beverage that didn't sit right with you. And that is the craziness of it all. You treated these people the way you treated them, and you didn't expect them to retaliate. Okay, well, that's all I got to say, folks. Thank you, those who listened to this entire video. Thank you so much. Share this channel and videos with people you think who will be interested, or is interested in history, especially things that they didn't really hear about or know about. You'll find those videos on this channel. I'm about to shut down the shop, and I will see you in the next video.